Wow, thank you. Thank you, Senator Booker, for your faith and your vision and for inspiring all of us today. Wade, thank you for your leadership and for organizing this and for deciding the series of who would speak first and second. You're fired, but we love you. My God. A lot of us in this room have been trying for the past week to scrape ourselves off the floor. And to me, Tuesday night felt like someone had died. First, you're in denial, and then you start to accept the horror of it. And just when you come up for air, they say, wait, there's more. The top advisor to the White House has direct ties to white nationalists and has given voice to the alt-right movement. Names floated for our country's top cabinet positions include those who believe waterboarding is not torture, and that torture is in our national interest anyway. Another invented stop and frisk and promises to bring back racial profiling, and another wants to deploy everyday citizens, a la the Stasi, to spy on one another in order to rip apart the fabric of society and deport undocumented children. And then you think, well, we survived Nixon, and we survived Henry Kissinger, who was a war criminal, as Secretary of State. But a lot of people in East Timor and Chile and Tibet and Bangladesh and the civilians he bombed in Cambodia did not survive. And a lot of people will not survive the next 4 years. So it's up to all of us to do our best, with every tool that we have been blessed with, to work to make our country more just and peaceful. We in this room, we have the most powerful tools of all because we have something they don't have. A belief that liberty and justice truly are for all. So it seems to me we have a special duty before us these next 4 years, a duty to expose injustice and to assure that the United States lives up to our best values and that we call out our leaders and our people each and every time they fail. And in light of that, we have chosen well today to recognize Andrea James and Glenn Martin. I could not imagine being among more suitable torchbearers to take this fight on to the next 4 years and the next 4 decades. We are so very proud to be with both of you. Andrea and Glenn are fighting the system of mass incarceration. Today, there are more than 70 million Americans who have criminal records and have been directly impacted by our criminal justice system, not to mention the millions more who are indirectly affected because they have had family members incarcerated. In fact, 1 in 4 women in the United States have a family member who were incarcerated, and for Black women, it's 1 in 2. One of the many drivers of mass incarceration is the unfair and Kafkaesque bail system, which Senator Booker spoke about. Let me tell you a little bit about it in my city of New York. When people are arrested in New York City, they go before a judge, and the judge sets bail, and if they can make bail a few $100s in cash, they get to go home. But many poor people cannot get their hands on that amount of cash. They end up on Rikers Island. 75% of the 10,000 people on Rikers Island are only accused of a crime. They have not been found guilty and are innocent in the eyes of the law. They might have a kid at home who needs to be cared for, a job which they need to show up to. So a lawyer comes along and says, if you plead guilty, even though you didn't do the crime, You can go home today. Otherwise, you could be stuck in the hellhole of Rikers for days or weeks or months. Imagine. 90% of the people who make bail and get to go home are never convicted. 90% who make bail never get convicted. But 90% of those who can't post bail do get convicted. It is haunting to consider how many innocent people are convicted, not because they're guilty, but because they are so desperate to leave Rikers that they wind up taking a plea. This system works well for judges because they move their cases off the docket. And it works well for prosecutors because they can claim so many guilty without the bother of going to a trial. The people who get hurt are the poor and the innocent and all of us who share in this community. They have kids to care for at home. They have livings to make. It's a minor offense, so they take the deal. And they get out of Rikers, but they have pleaded guilty to crimes. If they live in public housing, they can't live there with a criminal record. If they're employed at hourly rate jobs and missed a few days of work, they're likely already fired. And few other employers will hire them now because they have a criminal record. It's a destructive whirlpool of poverty, incarceration, and injustice. As Attorney General more than 50 years ago, Daddy recognized the unfairness of the bail system. What he said then could be said across our country today. Quote, "Every year in this country, thousands are kept in jail for weeks and even months following arrest. They are not yet proven guilty. They may be no more likely to flee than you or I, but most of them must stay in jail because, to be blunt, they cannot afford to pay for their freedom," unquote. Robert Kennedy helped pass the Criminal Justice Act of 1964 and the Bail Reform Act of 1966, transforming the federal bail policies. But those laws didn't impact state and local jurisdictions, which hold 90% of the 2.3 million incarcerated people today. This is the new Jim Crow. Like Robert Kennedy, Andrea James, and Glenn Martin have dedicated themselves to remedying such injustices and the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration. This year's Human Rights Award goes to both of them together. That's not typical, but it is altogether fitting. It honors their work, but also the full spectrum of the community working on these issues. They nicely complement one another. Andrea grew up in Boston. Glenn was born in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Both places were deeply linked to Daddy. The issue of mass incarceration is not an academic exercise for them. Both of them were incarcerated. Glenn was incarcerated for 6 years in his youth, first at Rikers Island and then at Attica. Despite the abuse, the solitary confinement, and other inhuman conditions, triple bunked at 150% capacity, he studied and he got his college degree. When he got out, he started facing all the barriers that everyone faced, rejected by over 50 employers because of his felony conviction. The Election Commission told him he couldn't vote, but he didn't stop. He went to work answering the phones at a social justice organization, making $17,000 a year, while still owing the state of New York over $100,000 in fines and fees and restitution. He threw himself into his work, learning what it took to push public policy forward, working himself up over 2 decades to multiple leadership positions. But even that wasn't enough, because he realized that those who were most impacted by the system were still being silenced in the halls of power, and even by their advocates themselves. Today, he is one of the most respected minds and strategists in criminal justice reform, founding Just Leadership USA to end mass incarceration by empowering formerly incarcerated people to be at the forefront of the movement. Already, in just a few years, he has equipped hundreds of leaders across the country to be the voices of reform, most recently hosting the largest gathering of formerly incarcerated people ever to focus on reforming the system. And then there is Andrea. Andrea worked as a lawyer in criminal justice for 25 years before turning herself in for wire fraud that occurred while she was desperately trying to help people with subprime mortgages avoid losing their homes in the financial crisis. She was sentenced to 24 months in federal prison and forced to say goodbye to her 5-month-old son and her 12-year-old daughter for 2 years. She was stunned by the conditions she faced, by the sea of black and brown, the overwhelming racial makeup of the prisons, by the great number of women in prison, most serving long mandatory sentences for minor drug possession or sales crimes, most of them mothers, and by the unremedied sexual abuse from corrections officers. Imagine going before a jury, a corrections officer, and somebody who's been convicted of a crime. Imagine the impossibility of holding that corrections officer accountable. Far from letting the circumstances overwhelm her, Andrea responded with tremendous resilience and vision. While in prison, she founded a roundtable to support current and formerly incarcerated women and wrote a book. And upon her release, she republished that book and transformed that roundtable into an organization getting formerly incarcerated women and girls the support they needed. She received a prestigious Soros Justice Fellowship, transforming a national network of formerly incarcerated women into the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, which now boasts a membership of thousands across the country and is empowering more and more women every day. Every year, this award is given to the most remarkable human rights defenders around the world, people who are working often at grave personal risk for the nonviolent pursuit of human rights. Both Andrea and Glenn embrace the most American of democratic values, the belief that people closest to a problem are best poised to solve it. Together, Andrea and Glenn are precisely the moral leaders our country needs to solve one of its most pressing human rights problems right here at home. Today, we honor Andrea and Glenn, but this is not the end, it is the beginning. Andrea and Glenn will walk out of here with more than a bust of Robert Kennedy, having enjoyed this beautiful ceremony and your magnificent company. Both of these laureates will benefit in unique and complementary ways from the programmatic partnerships with Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights to advance their struggles to achieve criminal justice reform. I am so excited. We are so excited to be working with you. Please stand as Mrs. Kennedy presents the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award to Andrea and Glenn. Thank you.